So, you've come to this point in your journey where you've been building powerful and dynamic apps with Vue, but you're starting to hit a limit on what you can do with purely front-end technologies. For example, while it's cool that you're able to create individualized sessions of data locally, the reality is that users have come to have this expectation that their data will be able to persist across things like multiple sessions of using the app, or frankly, being able to access their data across multiple devices. And that's where the need for a database comes in. But when it comes to choosing technology, it can be fraught with frustration and decision paralysis because, well, there's frankly a lot to choose from. And while going in depth on the different types of databases goes well beyond the scope of this course, I thought we'd go ahead and cover 3 high-level categories that you should probably be aware of. Relational databases are the most common type of databases when people are talking about choosing a database. And the reason for that is because they have a very highly structured approach, and really, they've been around for a long time. So people had a lot of experience with them. If you're new to relational databases, think of them like spreadsheets, where you have structured rows and columns that identify how the data should be structured and how the data is organized. But when it comes to how they relate, you have these foreign keys, basically specific columns that have identifiers that allow you to connect it from different rows to different tables and so forth and so forth. And that's how you create relationships between your data. Some popular examples of relational databases include MySQL, Postgres. A newer category of databases that's a bit more cutting edge but worth mentioning are graph databases. And while graph databases are also interested in the relationship between data, they're much more specialized as far as being able to represent data that's far more complex and has different connections in comparison to a traditional relational database. The third and final type of database that we'll be talking about today is document-based databases. As the name implies, this model stores data in the form of documents that are often in a JSON format, which many of us are familiar working with as front-end developers. This is probably one of the reasons why Firebase has been a popular choice for many web developers and why we'll be using it for this course. And to clarify, you don't need any prior experience when it comes to working with databases. I just want to make sure you have a high-level understanding of what databases are and the types of databases that are out there so that when you're learning about this one and choosing to look at other alternatives, you know what category you're in. That said, some prerequisites which will be helpful when it comes to navigating the code base for this course include fundamental Vue 3 knowledge, so you know things like components, some basic techniques when it comes to things like props and slots and those kind of things. And then the ability to know about Vue Router and how it works in regards to navigation for the app. And Pinia when it comes to managing state management across the entire app. And if you need to brush up on any of these topics, we'll be sure to have them linked down below for you. But otherwise, in this course, you'll be working on a food review app that you'll be taking to the next level by implementing a database as well as user authentication with Firebase. When people talk about Firebase, one of the common misconceptions is that Firebase itself is the database, as if when we talk about like Postgres or we talk about like MySQL and you hear people talk about that, you might think Firebase is the database. But that's not quite true. So here we are on firebase.google.com, and you'll notice here that on the very first line, you'll actually learn about what Firebase is, which is that it's an app development platform. In other words, it's a lot more than a database. And so we'll cover what Firebase offers, but that's the first thing I just want to clear up, is that Firebase has a lot more to offer underneath the hood beyond just the database portion. Now, granted, that'll be a big part of what we talk about in this course and what we use, but as I sort of allude to in the first lesson, we'll also be talking about another service that's actually very popular in terms of when building apps, which is what? User authentication. As we go through, you'll also see, as you can see here, that there's different categories of products that Firebase offers. But more importantly, something that I do want you to know about is the fact that Firebase, and one of the reasons it's used and chosen by a lot of developers, is that, as you can see, it's used by a lot of really big names. As you can see here, we can have things like New York Times, Alibaba.com, Lyft, Venmo, Duolingo. Clearly, we have a lot of different types of apps that are using it, and it's basically been battle tested. And so that's something that's really important for us as developers when choosing our tooling, because we want to choose something that people have, one, actually gone out and used with users so that we can build those products and then leverage that experience for our own app. Another reason why Firebase is really popular with developers is because, as we can see here, it actually is designed to be easily integrated across all the different platforms. A lot of times when it comes to choosing products, it's easy to focus on the web side of things. But if you have the kind of app that eventually is going to go across multiple devices, it's nice to know that the database or the platform you're using supports other things. So as you can see here, Android, iOS, even Unity for game development. Firebase supports all of these different platforms, which means it really allows you a lot of possibility when it comes to developing your app. Let's go ahead and dive right into getting started. The important thing for you to know when it comes to working with Firebase is really all you need is a Google account. If we check out the pricing right here, you'll see that basically it's at no cost to you. Like a lot of the popular services these days, they want you to have the ability to try it out and see if it makes a lot of sense to you. And then obviously, if you actually grow to have users and have a lot of requests, well, by that point, it'll probably make more financial sense to actually then pay for the service and figure out whether or not that makes sense. But in the meantime, let's learn about Firebase together at no cost to you. So in terms of getting started, I mentioned we needed a Google account, but really all we need to do here once we are signed in, as you can see here, there's my little avatar up there in the top, we'll just click the Getting Started button on the firebase.google.com. And this brings us to the Firebase console. As you can see here, you can see all the different Firebase projects that you have permissions to access. And as you can see, I have the Vue Mastery one. But what we're going to do, we're going to create a brand new project. So for this project, I'm going to call this Vue Eats because as I mentioned before in the first lesson, we're working on a food review app. And so for me, I kind of like the idea of Vue Eats, kind of like you eats, you know? I don't know, fun little play on words. But let's go ahead and click continue. And then you'll see here we have the option now to configure the analytics for the Firebase project. Given that we're buying into the Google ecosystem and analytics is an important part of tracking and understanding what your users are doing, I'm just going to leave this enabled by default. But if for whatever reason you're not going to be using Google Analytics or you want to use something else, that's totally fine. You can just disable it. It's not required for this course. Once we do that, we can actually associate the account for where the Google Analytics is. If you chose it for me, I'll just associate it to my Ben Code Zen account. And then we'll go ahead and let it create. All right, and with that, our new project is ready. As you see, once we click continue now, we're redirected into what is basically the project dashboard. And as you can see here, we can see that it gives us these easy call to actions as far as getting started by working with whatever platform is relevant for our app. And for us, we're not working on iOS, we're not working on Android, but we are working on web. So we could just do that directly. But before we do that, I wanted to give you a sense of what I mean when I said that Firebase is a platform. So remember I showed you the different categories earlier on the homepage? You'll see here that the product categories also exist here on the left-hand side. So if you take a look at things like build, you'll notice that there's a ton of offerings here from things like authentication, app check, which, and all these databases, which we'll cover in just a second. There's extensions, storage, hosting. As you can see, there's a lot going on in here. And then on top of that, under build, you'll see that under release and monitor, there's a whole thing for basically your DevOps, for looking at performance, your analytics for when things crash, etc. As we mentioned earlier regarding analytics, you have your whole platform for that. And then of course, engage, you even have things like A/B testing and messaging and honestly, just so much stuff. So obviously Firebase can have a whole masterclass in itself as far as understanding every single tool. But here's the thing. When it comes to learning any technology, it's easy to be like, oh, I have to learn everything. But as a developer, we want to learn the thing that's going to basically leverage the most amount of effort for the rewards that we're going to end up getting. So in other words, just like the Pareto effect, 20% of your efforts yield 80% of your results. Well, a lot of times when it comes to Firebase, the two things that people want to know about, because it helps to really unlock what we can offer our customers, is the ability to store data inside of the database and then leveraging the authentication so that we can protect that data so that everyone can have their own basically personalized set of data. That said, though, one of the first things you'll probably notice here is that there are two different databases that are being mentioned here. There's the Firestore database and the real-time database. Now, we could certainly go into all the differences between what is, which one is the right one for you. And there's a link here that we'll link below inside of the lesson for you to read about in case you're really curious about the differences between the two. The main thing you need to know about these two databases is that one of them is the older one and the other one is the newer one. And the older one is real-time database. And the new one that they would prefer you to basically mostly use is the Cloud Firestore. So that's what we're going to go ahead and use, since that's kind of basically the more cutting edge one that they seem to be pushing us towards. But more importantly, as always, go ahead and take a look if you want to read this article to see which one might make the most sense. But for the most part, I would say for a lot of the apps that I've seen in the ecosystem, learning Cloud Firestore is a great place to start. And as always, if you have a special situation where you might need the real-time database, go ahead and check that out and see if that's a better fit for you. But just to reiterate, for this course, we'll be using Cloud Firestore. All right, so now that we have it here, let's go ahead and just create our first database. And that is as simple as clicking on this button right here, Create Database. Once that's been spun up, you can see that we have two different modes that we can start it in, production or test mode. We'll just go ahead and do it in production mode because again, at this point, this is just basically a little side project we're doing. But in the future, if you're ever concerned about people accessing it or what it might happen in terms of like usage, go ahead and use test mode. But I'm gonna go ahead and use production mode for the course. In terms of the location, you can basically choose where it's going to be. Think of this as like the servers for where you're gonna hit the data. And so typically, when it comes to side project like this, I usually want to choose whatever is closest to us. as far as like the developer. So in my case, I'm in the United States, so I'm totally fine leaving it there. But in the case you're watching this from Asia or you're in Europe, probably want to make sure that that's located closer to you just to make the latency of transferring data between the server and you just a little bit faster. And in the future, as you might have known, there is that warning there that tells you that you can't change this later. So in the event you're obviously creating a new instance and you're thinking about where you want to provision it, that's where you obviously might want to think about where your primary user base is and then use that as the point of like the primary location for your VueFire store. And now that we've completed those prompts, believe it or not, we have created our first database. And what you'll notice here is that we have this little dashboard, this interactive dashboard for how we interact with the database. Remember how in the first lesson, we talked about how relational databases are like spreadsheets where you have columns and rows? Well, don't forget, we're in a document-based database when we're working with Firebase. And so what they call these basically collections of documents is, well, as you can see here, a collection. So since we're talking about a food review site, let's start with a collection of cafes. And so for here, you might be like, okay, let's start a new collection and these will be cafes. And then we'll click next. And then what we'll see here now is you'll have the ability to define basically the structure of the document when it comes to that. So in this case, we can do like auto ID to allow Firebase to generate an ID. But in case you have a specific document ID you want to give it to, you totally can. But then in this case, we can be like, well, okay, so for example, if we want a custom one just to make things a little bit easier from a readability perspective at the moment, we say, well, at the moment, we'll say this will be a cafe with a view. And then we can add certain things about the cafe. We can say, well, let's see, the price. And the price, we're going to make this a number. And so we'll basically do like a category, which we'll explain on the UI later. But basically, we'll say like price 1 is like it's cheap, 2, 3, 4, all the way 4 being like super expensive. Let's say maybe that's like over like $100 for a meal for a single person. And so let's say cafe with the view is on like the moderately inexpensive side. We can say 2. And we can do things like, oh, like where is it, located? So we can say like location. And so in this case, let's just keep it simple. I'm just going to say it's going to be in the United States. And then finally, we'll just add a Boolean property of whether it's a favorite or not. So here, Boolean. At the moment, we'll just say false. This is not a favorite just yet. And we can save that. And what you'll see here now is that everything generates as this sort of like basically the ability to reference things within a collection of documents. So as you can see here, we have a collection of cafes. And now within the collection, we have these documents. We have cafe with the view, and we can actually see the properties of our document inside of here, which is pretty darn cool. Because essentially what this is, if you think about it, it looks a lot like the dev tools. Like you get to inspect what's going on underneath. So we could add another cafe here. So what's another cafe? Let's see. We can do the rainforest with computed properties, for example. And for this one, we'll do similar properties. But one of the things you'll notice immediately, though, is that unlike a traditional database where once you decide on a schema, basically how your data is going to be structured for the entire table, like on a spreadsheet, in this particular case, it's incredibly flexible. It says, define what it is that you want. And this is, call it one of the double-edged swords of document-based databases in that they're really flexible, but then as far as enforcing the schema, if it's a little bit trickier in that regard. Our properties are pretty simple at the moment, so let's go ahead and do that. What do we have? We had the price that we were going to do, so the price. And let's say the rainforest. Rainforest is fancy. It's got like a bunch of organic stuff, so let's make this one like a 4. It's got like cool scenery and everything, super expensive. And then where's the location? This one, we're just gonna, let's say this one's gonna be in like Brazil, so more South America area. And then this one, we're going to say, is this a favorite? This one, we're going to say this is a favorite. So this is a Boolean, and we'll say it's favorite. And so now we save that, you'll see that our next document has generated. And you can see, there we go. We have the same 2 properties in here. And what's neat about this is that you can go in and change the stuff, and you're basically live updating a database. That's what we're ultimately doing. And something else is worth mentioning here, though, is that we also have the ability to create collections within the document. So basically, you can nest those collections. And if we think about it, as you start to see this unfold, a collection is essentially an array. That's really what it is. And inside of that array, you can put a bunch of stuff. And so inside of those things, i.e. those documents, you then put other collections. And so you can nest collections within documents. And it's cool because you get a lot of flexibility with this. But once again, it's like one of the things where you get to manage how that works. And that can be a double-edged sword, but just know these are the pros and cons of working with things like that. And then for the sake of demonstrating this, we can start other collections as well. So, we have a collection of cafes. We might want a collection of restaurants. And so inside of this restaurants, we might be like, okay, well, this one is going to say, love the view. And then inside of here, let's do something slightly different. Let's say restaurants have slightly different properties. So we can have a price, and this price for the number has a great view. Let's say this one's a 3. And then this time the location, we'll keep that similar in string. And this one, we're gonna put this in Europe. Let's put this in France. And then we'll have the favorite property for restaurants as a Boolean as well. We'll make this one false, but we can also add something else. So let's say, for example, we start wanting to add tags for restaurants, but cafes don't need tags. Well, here we can actually add an array. And then inside of the array, you can see we have different types. So in this side of case, let's obviously we'll have the different types of food that they have here. So let's say, for example, I want to just tag it crepes so that in the future I can find all the restaurants that are related to crepes. That's all that is. So once I save that, we'll see here, now we have this additional collection with basically the restaurants that are inside of it. And with that, you actually now have the fundamentals as far as creating a brand new database with Firebase, and then administering it, creating data, modifying data, and being able to just inspect things as you go, which is an incredibly powerful thing to have, because once we start getting into the programmatic aspect of working with Firebase in terms of like hitting APIs to automatically populate data, fetching it down, updating it, deleting records, which we'll be doing for the rest of the course, it's nice that you'll be able to always come back here and always inspect things and know where everything is. Whereas with some of the other databases, sometimes it was a bit involved as far as like making sure you had the right software downloaded, and then you have to learn how to interact with different tables. This, as you can see here, really does feel a lot like the native tooling that we're used to as web developers when it comes to being able to inspect data, modify them, and then just keep working on the things we love best, which is building our application and then shipping that over to our users. With that said, I hope you're excited, because going forward, we're gonna be diving right into the code, working with Vue 3, Firebase, and especially the official binding library for Vue 3, VueFire.